stumbled onto the stage, mumbled incoherently, and left millions of Australians stunned. Was he drunk, defiant, or simply misunderstood? That night in 1987, on live national television, James Reyne, once the golden voice of Australian rock, delivered a performance so chaotic that it instantly became one of the most infamous moments in the country's music history. What followed was a media storm that nearly obliterated his solo career before it had even begun. James Reyne wasn't just another rock star. As the charismatic frontman of Australian Crawl, he had led one of the most beloved surf rock bands of the 1980s, with hit after hit capturing the raw, sun-soaked spirit of coastal Australia. His voice, unmistakably nasal and poetic, was woven into the cultural fabric of a generation. But fame is fickle, and in a single unfiltered moment, it turned on him. The Countdown Revolution incident wasn't just an awkward slip-up. It was a national spectacle. Reyne's blurred speech, half-laughing responses, and erratic posture became instant tabloid fodder. Was it alcohol, arrogance, or a subtle rebellion against the rigid, artificial nature of the TV industry? The public watched in disbelief. The media sharpened their knives, and what could have been a triumphant solo launch turned into a PR disaster. But behind the scandal, behind the slurred words and frozen camera shots, lies a story more layered and far more human than anyone cared to ask at the time. A story of resistance, misinterpretation, and the unbearable pressure of staying authentic in an industry that often demands the opposite. Tonight, we go back to that moment. We dig beyond the surface to uncover what really happened on that stage and what it cost James Reyne in the years that followed. In the sun-drenched Australian summer of the late 1970s, a new sound began drifting from the surf towns of Victoria, raw, jangly, and unapologetically local. That sound was Australian Crawl, and leading the charge was a tall, sharp-featured frontman with a voice unlike any other, James Reyne. With his angular presence, cryptic lyrics, and a delivery that teetered between spoken word and melodic chant, Reyne didn't just sing songs. He painted scenes of Australian life, soaked in saltwater, pub smoke, and suburban angst. By the early 1980s, Australian Crawl had become a phenomenon. Their debut album, The Boys Light Up, was a radio staple, followed by chart-topping records like Sirocco and Sons of Beaches. They weren't just making music, they were shaping the national identity. James Reyne stood at the center of it all. Articulate, intense, a man who seemed to carry both the weight of poetry and the burden of something unspoken. As the band reached its peak, cracks began to show. Internal tensions, the pressures of fame, and a series of tragic events, including the death of founding member Brad Robinson's wife, actress Carrie Armstrong's tragic miscarriage, and the eventual passing of bandmate Guy McDonough, cast shadows on the group's sunlit image. By 1986, Australian Crawl had dissolved, and Reyne, always the reluctant frontman, was suddenly alone. Determined to forge a solo path, he signed with Capitol Records and prepared to launch his debut single. The timing couldn't have been better. Reyne was still a household name, and expectations were high. He was slated to perform live on Countdown Revolution, a nationally broadcast music program that had long been the heartbeat of Australian pop culture. But television, unlike the chaos of live gigs, came with scripts, time codes, and stiff-lipped hosts. What happened next would be remembered not as a musical debut, but a career-altering explosion. James Reyne walked onto the Countdown set in May 1987 with a grin that barely hid his contempt. As the host introduced him, Reyne responded with slurred, stuttering banter, barely coherent and tinged with sarcasm. His demeanor was loose, offbeat, almost performative, as if mocking the very format he was part of. He introduced his new song, Fall of Rome, in a tone so bizarre it left even the hosts visibly unsettled. The segment aired live. The phone lines lit up. Newspapers rolled out their headlines the next morning. Reyne's disaster on live TV. Rumors swirled. Was he drunk? Was he high? Was he having a breakdown? But some observers saw something different, a protest. Reyne had long been critical of the commercialization of music, and many suspected his erratic performance was a middle finger to the artificiality of television. Years later, in interviews, he hinted that the moment was misunderstood, that he was poking fun at the media machine, not losing control. Regardless of intent, the damage was immediate. Broadcasters began pulling appearances. Promoters grew wary. James Reyne's name, once spoken with admiration, now carried a question mark. And the haunting irony? His debut solo single would go on to become a hit, but the shadow of that night never left him. This was no ordinary scandal. It wasn't about drugs or infidelity. It was about perception, about what the public expects, what the media demands, and what happens when an artist refuses to play the part. James Reyne's story didn't begin with scandal. It began with promise. Born in Lagos, Nigeria, in 1957 to Australian parents, Reyne was raised in Victoria, a sun-soaked corner of the world that would become both his home and his muse. He studied drama at Monash University before turning his creative instincts toward music. In 1978, he co-founded Australian Crawl, a band that quickly became synonymous with the new wave of Aussie rock. Clever lyrics, punchy rhythms, and a distinctly local flavor that set them apart from the British and American acts dominating the charts. From the outset, Reyne stood out. His voice, nasal, breathless, almost percussive, was divisive. Some found it odd, even off-putting, but most found it unforgettable. It became a signature, one that could cut through any radio static and demand attention. And it wasn't just the voice, it was the writing. Songs like Beautiful People and The Boys Light Up combined sly social commentary with beach town swagger, offering a glimpse into suburban Australia with both affection and critique. By 1981, Australian Crawl was at the top of their game. Their sophomore album Sirocco hit #1, powered by anthems like Errol and Things Don't Seem. They toured relentlessly, their concerts growing from local pubs to packed arenas. Reyne, with his piercing eyes and kinetic stage presence, became a reluctant sex symbol, idolized by teens, scrutinized by tabloids, and hounded by the industry. But behind the cool exterior was a man increasingly disillusioned by fame. The pressure mounted. In 1983, the band released Semantics, featuring the hit Reckless, a moody, atmospheric departure from their earlier work, and one of Reyne's most introspective songs. It was a sign of evolution, but also of division. Internal disagreements about direction, combined with the emotional toll of constant touring and personal losses, began to fracture the group. Tragedy hit hard. Guy McDonough, a core member and close friend of Reyne, died in 1984 from complications related to hepatitis. The death shook the band to its core. Though they tried to push forward, the chemistry was gone. By 1986, after releasing Between a Rock and a Hard Place, Australian Crawl quietly disbanded. For Reyne, this marked both an end and a beginning. Critics wondered if he could survive outside the band's identity. But he wasn't interested in staying comfortable. With a new record deal and a desire to push his sound into darker, more sophisticated territory, he began crafting his self-titled debut album. The lead single, Fall of Rome, was taut and menacing, built on brooding bass lines and lyrical imagery that veered far from the sun-drenched beaches of Crawl's early years. It was clear, James Reyne wasn't here to replicate the past. He was rewriting the script. Then came Countdown Revolution. What should have been a triumphant solo debut quickly spiraled into chaos. His on-air behavior, slurred, twitchy, almost mocking, shocked the nation. Viewers didn't know what to make of it. Some laughed, some were outraged. Industry insiders whispered about intoxication. Others speculated performance art. Reyne never confirmed, never denied. He let the ambiguity fester. The incident went viral, at least by 1980s standards. Columnists dissected it. Music shows replayed it. A promising solo career had detonated before it left the launchpad. And yet, despite the bad press, Fall of Rome became a hit. The album sold well. Reyne toured, but the stain of that night followed him. Promoters hesitated. TV appearances dried up. And fans, once rabid, began to fracture into believers and skeptics. This was the turning point. From adored frontman to controversial soloist, James Reyne had crossed a line. Whether he tripped or jumped, no one could say for sure. What was clear was that the fall from pop darling to pariah was sudden, dramatic, and entirely public. For years, the 1987 Countdown Revolution incident stood as an open wound in James Reyne's career, broadcast, replayed, and whispered about in music circles with a mix of amusement and disbelief. To the public, it was simple. He appeared drunk on live television, slurring his words, smirking inappropriately, and stumbling through an awkward performance of self-sabotage. But behind the chaotic appearance lay a deeper, more layered reality. one that few cared to uncover at the time. Reyne, when pressed in later interviews, always stopped short of confirming intoxication. Instead, he hinted at something more deliberate, more pointed. In one rare conversation, he stated, "I wasn't drunk, I was just being a smartass. The whole thing was a bit of a farce." To those close to him, it wasn't surprising. Reyne had long harbored disdain for the manufactured and plastic polish of mainstream music television. The rehearsed lines, the false enthusiasm, the constant pressure to smile and perform, not as an artist, but as a product. What many didn't know was that Reyne had fought with producers in the hours before going live. He'd allegedly refused to stick to their script, challenged the rigidity of the format, and finally walked on stage determined to play by his own rules. What came across as drunken behavior, he claimed, was actually dry satire, his way of mocking the very industry that had commodified his artistry. But satire doesn't always translate, especially not on primetime television. Viewers didn't see rebellion, they saw a fall from grace. And the media, ever hungry for a scandal, didn't wait for context. Headlines screamed, "Reyne off the rails," "Rockstar meltdown on live TV," and "Australian crawl to Australian creep." Public opinion soured almost overnight. The consequences were swift and brutal. Promotional appearances for his debut solo album were canceled. A scheduled follow-up interview on Hey Hey It's Saturday was quietly scrapped. One record executive reportedly told Capitol, "We can't sell someone who insults the audience on national TV." Reyne's phone stopped ringing. Radio support cooled. Industry allies distanced themselves. And perhaps the cruelest irony? Fall of Rome. The very song he introduced in that disastrous segment was a haunting, elegant track about the slow collapse of empires. It climbed the charts despite the scandal, proving that the music, at its core, still resonated. But for many, the image of Reyne's smirk on Count had already overshadowed the artistry behind it. There were others who saw the truth. Fellow musicians, particularly those disillusioned with the commercial machine, defended Reyne's defiance. Some viewed it as punk rock in spirit, raw, unfiltered, a jab at the sanitized pop culture of the late 80s. Nick Cave once remarked in passing, "James had the guts to go off script. They punished him for it." Behind the scenes, Reyne was deeply affected. Though he rarely showed vulnerability in public, friends noted a growing sense of bitterness. He withdrew from media, avoided interviews, and poured himself into touring. Gritty, intimate gigs where he could reconnect with fans without the distortion of cameras or corporate agendas. The public never fully reconciled with what happened that night. To some, it remained a cautionary tale. To others, a misunderstood moment of artistic rebellion. But for Reyne, it was a scar, a moment when he chose authenticity over compliance and paid the price in full. The man who once stood atop the Australian music world had faced his fall, not in a blaze of crime or scandal, but in a single, misunderstood performance. And the echoes of that night would follow him for decades. James Reyne remains one of the most paradoxical figures in Australian music, revered, ridiculed, and resilient all at once. At Aussie Uncovered, we believe the night of Countdown Revolution was not a fall, but a fracture, a moment where public expectation collided head-on with an artist's refusal to conform. There is no denying that Reyne's on-air demeanor was strange, even off-putting, but to reduce that moment to mere intoxication is to miss the deeper narrative. The industry wanted polish. Reyne gave them parody. And in doing so, he exposed the artifice of television performance in a way that was, perhaps, too honest for its time. What happened next was telling, not just of the media's power to frame, but of the audience's quickness to judge. Reyne was branded disrespectful, arrogant, unprofessional. The fact that he never offered a public apology only hardened the perception. But maybe that was the point. Reyne had always walked a thin line between public figure and private poet. In choosing not to explain himself, he preserved a piece of his autonomy, even if it cost him favor. When we look back at James Reyne's legacy, it's clear that his contributions to music run deep. With Australian Crawl, he helped define a generation of sound that was distinctly Australian, sun-bleached, ironic, and emotionally resonant. As a solo artist, he ventured into darker, more personal territories, crafting songs that reflected inner struggle rather than outward charm. And yet, one moment continues to eclipse his achievements. Why? Because in a world that rewards compliance, Reyne dared to be unpredictable. Whether you see his countdown appearance as a meltdown or a middle finger depends on how you interpret integrity. For us, it was a flawed, fascinating glimpse into the discomfort of authenticity on a stage built for illusion. James Reyne is not a tragic figure. He is a survivor. He continued to release albums, tour extensively, and maintain a loyal fan base. The media moved on. The industry changed. But that night in 1987 remains suspended in amber, a moment when a rock star refused to act like one, and the world couldn't forgive him for it. So we ask you, how do you see that night? Was it arrogance, rebellion, or simply a misunderstood act of defiance? And more importantly, should we judge an artist by their worst public moment or by the full arc of their work? Long after the headlines faded and the television clips gathered dust in forgotten archives, James Reyne kept moving. Not loudly, not seeking redemption, but steadily, as if unbothered by the noise he left behind. He toured through decades, released album after album, and played to crowds who remembered not the scandal, but the voice. Raw, urgent, unmistakably his. And maybe that's what survives in the end. Not the night he slurred his words on national television, but the sound of reckless drifting across a car radio on a road trip up the coast. Not the sneers of commentators, but the verses that once gave shape to a generation that danced barefoot in pubs and shouted lyrics under the stars. Time has a way of sanding down the edges of controversy, and what once seemed outrageous now feels oddly brave. That infamous TV moment no longer defines James Reyne, it simply marks him. Like a scar earned from walking a different path. Some stories are never told, but now you know. Because beneath the smirk, behind the stumble, there was always something more. A voice that didn't just sing about Australia, but challenged it to listen. And maybe that's why, all these years later, we still do.